Subnautica has 23 wrecks, and just like my hopes and dreams, you can find them, broken and forgotten, strewn randomly across the seafloor. But not all of these wrecks are created equal, so which ones are worth visiting and which should you avoid? Today I'll be ranking every Subnautica wreck based on its location, safety, and what sorts of goodies you can find inside. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Oh boy, where do I even begin with this one? Well, for starters, it's one of the most isolated wrecks in the entire game, being just a stone's throw away from the crater edge. It's also tiny, meaning that of the fragments that can actually appear here, you probably won't get enough of the ones you actually want. But that's not even the worst part of it, because if you even want to get to this hunk of junk in the first place, you gotta deal with not one, but two Reaper Leviathans. Interestingly, this wreck is one of just 4 that doesn't have any internal name according to the wiki, and this is quite fitting because if it were to just slide into the void tomorrow, then literally no one would care. On to the first wreck that actually does have a name, that being Wreck 19. You know, I was gonna go on a huge rant about how this wreck has literally no redeeming qualities, but after discovering the previous wreck, I can think of one. That being, you only have to deal with 1 Reaper instead of 2. Besides that, same story, different wreck. It's stupidly deep in the mountains, tiny, and the only things that can be found here are better found elsewhere. Well, if I had a nickel for every crappy unnamed Dunes wreck, I'd have 2 nickels. But at least this one doesn't have 2 Leviathans for next door neighbors. The fragments still suck though, and even the 2 data boxes can't save this place. The only thing keeping this wreck a step up from the bottom 2 are the collectibles. You can find some lab equipment alongside a blue and gray cap here, meaning that for a select few people, it might actually be worth it to come here. I wouldn't bother with this one. The wreck is pretty far away and surrounded by lots of not fun things, like bone sharks, mesmers, and ampeels. Despite this, the loot pool here is pretty underwhelming, consisting mostly of modification station and scanner room fragments. And like a couple of the other wrecks we've talked about, it's just so small that the odds of you getting enough fragments for the things you actually want aren't all that great. It does have one slight saving grace though, as it's definitely the least horrible place to get the water filtration suit. If you want to do that for whatever reason. Wreck 17 is the first wreck that I'd say probably isn't a total waste of your time, but that doesn't mean it's very good. For whatever reason, the wrecks in the kelp forest just don't have a debris field, which really cuts down on the amount of available fragments. And given it's such an early wreck, the only things that can really spawn here are mobile vehicle bay and maybe a couple of stasis rifle fragments. Wreck 18 is pretty similar to Wreck 17, but with a couple advantages. Inside, you can find a data box for the compass, which can be really good for navigating early on. But there's a fairly decent chance you'll have found it already, since the same data box is also in Life Pod 3. Aside from that, you can also snag a couple of bioreactor fragments if you're lucky. Next up is Wreck 16. Now, you might think it being in the safe shallows makes it pretty quick to access, but since it's right near the Aurora, it's gonna end up being a good 300 to 400 meters away from your life pod in most cases. And this presents a problem for the wreck's loot. You see, there's a half a dozen smaller debris fields called scatters that are also dotted around the safe shallows. Since they aren't full-on wrecks, I decided not to include them in the video, but it is worth noting that they can give you most of the same fragments as this wreck. What that means is, unless you're headed directly there, you're probably going to have most of the blueprints unlocked before you actually visit this wreck. Not to mention the fact that you need a repair tool to even get inside. This wreck is honestly just a bit disappointing. It does have 3 decent data boxes for the reinforced dive suit, lightweight high-capacity O2 tank, and Cyclops sonar upgrade, but that's pretty much where the positives end. A lot of the stuff that can spawn here is just furniture, and like the first Bulb Zone wreck, the actual fragments are just not worth it for how dangerous the area is. Moving on to the first of 5 Grassy Plateaus wrecks, we have Wreck 12. Unfortunately, it's both the farthest and deepest of the Grassy Plateaus wrecks, which makes exploration difficult, especially if you don't have a rebreather. As for the loot, it shares a pretty similar fragment pool with the other 4 wrecks, with fragments for the mobile vehicle bay, bioreactor, and laser cutter being common. Speaking of which, you will need a laser cutter to get into the back room, which has most of the fragments. Rec 14 is very similar to Rec 12. It also requires a laser cutter, but it's a bit shallower and closer to spawn. Unlike Rec 12, Rec 14 also has sea moth fragments, and you do get a data box for the lightweight high-capacity O2 tank. Despite Rec 5's size, it ended up being pretty disappointing. The Rec has a huge list of things that can spawn. In fact, it's the most of any Rec in the entire game. But with all of these different items and fragments, it can be hard to find enough of the ones you actually want. And what's more, a sizable portion of the Rec is just completely inaccessible for some reason, which cuts off a large area that could otherwise spawn more fragments. The Rec also sits next to a Reaper Leviathan, and given that most players tend to travel around the left side of the mountain island, you're gonna have to go through it if you want to reach the Rec. The only somewhat good thing about this Rec is that it's probably the best single spot in the game to get nuclear reactor fragments. But if you don't need all of the fragments right away, you're probably better off going to some of the places that have lower spawn chances, but are also a whole lot safer. Despite Rec 6 being in the dunes, it's honestly not as bad as you might think. Don't get me wrong, it's still pretty mid, but its location near the edge of the dunes means that as long as you head directly from the Mushroom Forest, you won't have to deal with any Reapers. As for the loot, it's on par with a lot of the other high Recs, with the main staples being prawn suit arms, thermal plant fragments, and data boxes for things you likely already have. Unfortunately, there's just better places to get this stuff, even if it's more so due to the Rec's remoteness than imminent death. Unlike the other Safe Shallows Rec we talked about, this one is much easier to get to, and you can literally spawn directly on top of it if you get lucky. To compensate, it does have the smallest item pool of any of the Recs, but it's still usually enough to get you a full sea glide. The back room can be accessed as soon as you get a repair tool, and this can get you early mobile vehicle bay or even stasis rifle fragments if you're lucky. Rec 10 suffers from a similar problem to the Large Dunes Rec. It's got some decent mid to late game fragments, and 2 of the 3 data boxes are actually pretty good. It's also only about half the distance from 0-0. The biggest problem are the warpers, which make some of the Recs we're about to discuss look a lot more appealing. But I suppose if you haven't gotten infected yet, or don't mind the occasional teleportation, it's not a half bad place to get some loot. Rec 7 is pretty darn good, provided that you're able to find it. It's in the flat part of the Sea Treader's path, which can look quite a bit like the dunes at first glance. But if you can manage to get there, the Rec's contents are well worth it. There's 3 data boxes that guarantee some really nice Cyclops upgrades, and you can usually find a couple of nuclear reactor fragments. But perhaps best of all are the Cyclops bridge and hull fragments, which can go a long way towards you unlocking the sub. Rec 9 is one that I completely forgot existed, but I'm definitely gonna have to start visiting. It's literally within viewing distance of the northwestern grassy plateaus biome, so finding it shouldn't be much of a problem. Once you get there, you'll notice that, like the Recs in the kelp forest, this one doesn't have a debris field, but this is mostly made up for once you head inside. There's fragments for the power cell charger and modification station, and it's arguably the best spot to get the Cyclops thermal reactor. But like the previous Rec, the thing you're really gonna want are the Cyclops hull and bridge fragments. You can usually find 2 to 3 of each, and if you don't end up getting enough, well, you're already in the Mushroom Forest, which is the best place to get, yep, you guessed it, Cyclops hull and bridge fragments. So you'll probably be able to pick up the last couple pieces relatively close by. While not number 1, Rec 1 is certainly nothing to scoff at. For starters, it's right next to LifePod 6, meaning that if you've come to explore one, you'll basically be able to check out the other one free of charge. The Rec also sits mostly above 100 meters, which makes it a bit more forgiving if you don't have a rebreather. Inside, there's a decent amount of fragments, though seemingly not quite as many as the next Rec on our list. Still, this is easily one of the best places to get MVB fragments, along with the vehicle upgrade console and a natural selection 2 poster. Rec 13 is a great spot to get a lot of early to mid-game items. Outside, you can get bioreactor, sea moth, and scanner room fragments, while the inside has the data box for the Ultra Glide fins, along with fragments for the modification station, MVB, laser cutter, and a couple of other things. Despite being a bit smaller, it slightly edges out the previous wreck because it doesn't require a laser cutter to fully explore, making it a bit more practical in the early game. At first, Wreck 8 doesn't seem like it would be all that special. Sure, it has some prawn suit arms and a nuclear reactor fragment or two, but that's hardly anything we haven't seen before. So what causes this wreck to be so high up on the list? Well, it has to do with the wreck's location and its two data boxes. As you've probably noticed by now, Wreck 5 sits wedged down in the Blood Kelp Trench, which, in turn, means the wreck sits directly above an entrance to the Lost River. And if you're using the Cyclops and should choose to explore this wreck on your way down, you'll be rewarded with the blueprints for the Cyclops sonar and fire suppression systems, which will make the rest of your trip so much easier. Moving on to the last Grassy Plateaus wreck, this one isn't super noteworthy on the outside, but once you make your way in, you'll see why it's so good. For whatever reason, this wreck has a ton of modification station and mobile vehicle bay fragments, making it one of, if not the best place in the game to reliably get both. In fact, the only problem I have with this place is the actual wreck itself. Because of how this wreck is oriented, and with the only two entrances being near the top, it's very easy to get turned around in here. For that reason, I probably wouldn't recommend this one for hardcore players, but for everyone else, this is a really great spot to get a bunch of different fragments. Going into making this video, this is the wreck I thought would be number 1. And while it didn't quite make the top of the list, it's still easily one of the best wrecks in the game. Let's start off with the location. The wreck sits near Life Pod 19 in the Sparse Reef, making it easy to find and with virtually no danger. Then there's the wreck itself. It's quite unique in that it's actually split into two smaller sections, and while you do need a laser cutter to get in, you'd literally have to have a brain aneurysm to get lost and drown. Finally, the wreck has a ton of mid-game loot, and you can find fragments for the bioreactor, thermal plant, power cell charger, modification station, and moon pool pretty consistently. And if you still aren't convinced and somehow need one more reason to come here, I should also mention that this is easily the best place to get the blueprint for the reinforced dive suit, which cuts all the damage you take in half. Wreck 11 is one of the farthest wrecks in the game and by far the deepest, but unlike some other wrecks, for this one the trip is actually worth it. Starting with the data boxes, you're guaranteed blueprints for the Cyclops thermal reactor, decoy tube, and sonar upgrades. Then there's the numerous fragments for the prawn suit drill and grapple arm. And finally, the wreck also has some fun decorations, like a carryall, a gray cap, and the quilted double bed, which can only be found in one other wreck. And while it's not necessarily the best place to get some of these items, the fact that so many blueprints, upgrades, and decorations can be found in the same place makes this one of, if not the best overall wreck in the game. And finally, we have Wreck 4. Now, this wreck's plethora of fragments and 5, yes, you heard me right, 5 data boxes would probably already be enough to get this wreck into the top 3, but that's not why it's number 1. The answer to that question is a simple 3 words: Cyclops engine fragments. This is the best spot in the game to get them, and it's not even close. You don't know how many times I've seen people risking life and limb in the mountains or the crash zone just to get a couple of these, when they could have just gone to the relative safety of the underwater islands and picked from the 5 or 6 that regularly spawn. That is what truly puts this wreck above the rest. Now, I will admit that because of how similar a lot of these wrecks are, this list is probably more than a bit subjective. So if you think there's some wrecks that deserve to be higher or lower, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Anyways, that's all from me for now. I hope to see you all again very soon.